Hello, my name is Mike Wenzel, and kind of operate the carpentry shop. Just want to go over a few things this morning for safety purposes. If for any reason you find yourself needing a compound miter box, it's also referred to as chop saw. And anyway, this is this device, and there are a couple of things you need to keep in mind for safety purposes. Probably the most important thing is wear your eye protection. And for me, I've got some safety glasses that I have to be able to see the item with, plus reject sawdust or wood chips of any kind. Safety glasses and ear protection, which I'll put on, and we'll walk through that. Another item that's significant is that if you're going to cut a board, whether you're going to cut it on an angle or whether you're going to cut a straight 90, is that you want your board, whatever it is, you want it up against the fence. Make sure it's against the fence. If you just throw it on here and you don't have it against the fence, the blade is turning this direction. And if you engage that board while it's out here away from the fence, it's going to slam it up against the fence. It's going to smash your fingers, but even more importantly, sometimes it will drag your fingers into the blade. I personally have seen fingers amputated just because the person didn't have it against the fence. So push it against the fence. Have your ear protection on, your eye protection on. Another point that I'll make known to you also is that in addition to having the item that you want to cut up against the fence, the second thing is that after you've made your cut with the blade, let the blade come to a stop before you remove your items. Ultimately, what can happen is that because the blade is still turning and you got this board against this side of the blade, you got your cut piece against that side of the blade, and if you just raise it up like that, what sometimes will happen is the burrs on the blade will grab this piece and throw it up into the fence, throw it up into your body, throw it into your face. So wait till the blade comes to a stop before you remove your item. Here again, this is the table saw. It's a frequently used item as well. It too has its usage, respected, and it will treat you well as the compound miter respect it, and it will treat you well as well. These are machines that are not to be afraid of, but yet you do owe them respect. And I think it's been said before, one of the main contributors to accidents is when you get too familiar and too comfortable with yourself around it. So always use caution, always respect the tool. If you're going to cut a board, the first thing you got to be aware of is the height of your blade. So over here, you'll want to raise the blade up. Never raise your blade up excessively like that. That's just more opportunity for accidents. So your blade should always be kept to just enough to get through the board. Once you've achieved that, lock your blade in place. Put your fence back down, set whatever amount of cut that you want to cut. I'll rip this board here so you can see what it's like. We have push sticks available for pushing the item through. Keep your fingers protected. Here again, you've got eye protection on, you've got ear protection on. Also, I'll add in too is that when you're cutting on the table saw, the compound miter, or any of the other devices, you want your clothing to be firm fitting. Don't have shirt tails hanging out. Don't have clothes that can be grabbed or and jerked into the machinery. You want to push your item all the way through. Push your board all the way through. Don't try to remove this until you turn the blade off. Turn the blade off, let the motor run down, let the blade come to a stop. Once the blades come to a stop, then you can safely remove the board that you've cut. Push stick is so that you don't get your fingers in close to the blade. Also, you can be mindful of this as well. Sometimes when you're cutting a board, not only do you need a push stick to push the board through, but you also need the addition of another board over here holding this part against the blade. Okay, this is a combination sander. Has a 12-inch disc on it and a belt driven so that you can sand various applications. 80 grit is generally what I keep on these machines, an 80 grit disc or an 80 grit belt. They do make finer grits for different applications, but I've seen several people use this machine, and I've used it for years and years and years, this one and various ones like it. Sometimes the project that you're working on can be small, and then when they're small, that means your fingers are that much closer to the disc. And that's the safety part of this one here. You got to watch that. So when your board, if you're just wanting to say round the corners off, then you would turn it on and round the corners, keeping your fingers 2-3 inches back. You do want to make sure that you hold the board that you're working on this table. Keep it flat. You don't want to hold it up in the air like that or anything like that. It'll still sand, but because it's turning, it's going to slam your fingers. So keep your hands, keep your fingers away from the disc. Same thing on this one over here. Just keep it away from the disc if there's a project that you're working on and you need to use the disc. Common sense says keep your fingers away, but just know this, this 80 grit sandpaper, it'll take your skin down to the bone real quick if you're not watching. I'll show you what this all looks like now. Have your ear protection on, your eye protection. The other thing to keep in mind, as I said on the other machinery, make sure your clothes, your shirts, if you have a long sleeve shirt on, always be mindful of your clothing. Monitor your whole person and make sure that it stays away from these pieces of machinery, because if it grabs a hold of it, it'll pull you into it. This is the Grizzly bandsaw. It's just a couple years old. We had an older one, and but we got this new one. So the thing with a bandsaw from a safety standpoint, I've been doing woodworking for the biggest part of my life, and fortunately I still have all 10 digits. The only machine that I've actually ever been cut on is the bandsaw. Here again, keep in mind, familiar. Don't get too familiar with the machine. Get overly confident and don't get in too big of a hurry. Main thing you want to keep in mind with a bandsaw is exposed blade. If I were cutting this board here there's no need to have that much exposed blade. It's not necessary. So lower your blade down to where you're just barely clearing the board. It minimizes fingers getting in touch with it. Tighten your blade, make sure everything's tight. Whether you're ripping, cross-cutting, whatever the case may be. Secret to this tool, table saw, compound miter, any of them, is just know that because you've got a blade that's turning, a disc that's turning, whatever the case may be, that if it grabs a hold of that piece of wood, it could possibly pull your fingers into it, or it could flip it up and back hit you in the face or back hit you in the chest. That's why you always want to use some sort of push stick to keep your fingers away from those items. And have the eye protection on, the ear protection on. Keep your fingers away from the blades. Pretty much the rule with any of these saws. If proper execution is done, you're going to be safe. But if you try to cut corners, if you get in too big of a hurry, almost anything can happen.
All right, so the biggest principle with working with any type of power or hand tool is you have to understand what you're working with. If you do not, you need to go find somebody who does and have them explain it to you. But here are some basic principles for just some smaller hand tools that we in the mechanical department use regularly. Power drill. The biggest things to remember with these is you always want to know what the source of power is. So if you need to replace a bit on these, it's pretty straightforward. Not a lot of power going with these, but if you're, let's say, going to be putting on a drill bit, you might remove power to avoid accidentally hitting the trigger and causing yourself some damage. Always be aware of what your PPE is as well. With drills, probably not a lot of PPE required, but as we move toward other items like this bandsaw, this portable bandsaw, the same principle remains. If for any reason you need to work around the blade to replace it or whatever else, these always come with a locking mechanism, usually right near the trigger. It keeps the trigger from engaging. And then the other big principle to keep in mind too is their power source is going to be battery. So if you need to work around this blade, the best practice is to remove the battery, make sure your trigger is locked, and then begin to work on whatever you need to work on here. That goes for all of these tools. Always understanding what the source of power is. Even for this big grinder, it's not battery operated, it's plug-in. So the biggest thing to always keep in mind is what is this plugged into, and if you need to, for any reason, replace this blade, you would unplug it and check the trigger to make sure it is disengaged, okay? Those are the biggest principles, is always trying to remember what is the power source. If you need to, for this Sawzall, remove this blade. Again, you would lock it, you would remove the battery, you would check the trigger, and then you would remove the blade. That is the best policy, so that as you're removing the blade, let's say the battery is on and your trigger is not locked, and you bump against something as you are touching this blade, your finger will be sliced up. So that's principle number one, is always keeping in mind what is the source of power. and how can I disengage it? Locking the trigger and removing the power source. The other principle with any type of hand tool is understanding how you are cutting and taking the time to make sure that you are securing things. So let's say that we need to cut a pipe, and we're going to be using our bandsaw for it. The biggest principle is you could try to, brace it up against and cut, but you are putting your legs in danger. So throughout the shop and even throughout campus, you can always find something to give yourself a little bit more support. Take it out of your hands, put it in the hands of something that will be able to clamp it down and keep you from having to hold this. So from this, you could get your bandsaw, triple check to make sure it's all good, grab your proper PPE, gloves, glasses. None of these are very loud, so you probably do not need hearing aid, hearing protection, but as you move up, say the grinder, and you're gonna be using it for a while, you need to put hearing protection on. But for a common drill, you're probably fine with that noise. So you put your proper PPE on, you check to make sure everything is good and engaged, you release the trigger, and then you cut. You're cutting away from your body, and you're being careful to make sure that when you're said and done, you remove the source of power. So yeah, those are the basic principles to working with hand tools. And as a quick side note, if for any reason you are working on, let's say, a power operated device that is plugged in, let's say you are headed off to lunch and you've been working with this grinder, the best principle, always the best practice is if you are not with your tool and if you are not using it, simply unplug it, store away your cord, and then you can leave and do what you want. That also goes with any of the battery operated as well. When you put this on the shelf to put it into storage, just go ahead and remove the battery, set it next to it. It keeps it so that if somebody is shuffling through the shelf and they accidentally bump the trigger or whatever else, it's one more level of safety.